All right, everyone. It's 8:05. We still have folks joining, so really great turnout. But we do want to get started so we have as much time for this conversation as possible, as it's a very, very important one. So I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Gonzalez-Rojas. I am a candidate for New York State Assembly in the 34th District, which includes Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, and Woodside. And it's obviously a very challenging time to run for office, and we've shifted all our campaign work to focusing on both mutual aid and opportunities for sort of these virtual town halls and virtual engagement to learn about different issues that is related to the coronavirus. So a couple of days ago, our first webinar series was actually on the coronavirus itself with Dr. John Epstein. And just a couple of days ago, we had Leontine Greenberg, who joined us, who's a homeschool parent, as we prepared for, many of us as parents, prepared for our children to start remote learning this week. I myself have a third grader, and we got started this week as well. And let me tell you, the tips that Leontine provided was really, really helpful. And I'm definitely keeping that in mind as we move forward in this new world that we're operating in. So tonight I'm super, super excited to talk about managing mental health, recognizing symptoms, and how to combat them with Alpana Choudhury. And I'm so excited to have her, and I'll introduce her in a moment. But what I really want to underscore is that, you know, healthcare is something that is deeply important to me. It's a field I've been working in for over a decade. And as a candidate, ensuring that all people have access to the healthcare that they need is a priority. And mental health is certainly crucial for our overall health and well-being. As someone personally who's really been mostly self-quarantined for the past week and a half, I feel like, you know, we're consuming the negative and tragic news about this virus. And I could feel both the emotional and mental toll that has taken on myself and others. So again, I'm so grateful for the generosity of our guest tonight, who is a licensed mental health counselor and a fellow Jackson Heights resident. So as I mentioned, we're really shifting our regular campaign events to do these virtual webinars, to do calls to our neighbors to check in with one another and offer mutual aid. So we do ask if folks have some time to volunteer and help us make calls. That'd be fantastic, and that'll be available on the website. So you can sign up for a shift at votejgr.com /phone bank. So I'll share some logistics as well. So everyone is muted as we begin this conversation, but we really encourage your questions and engagement. So throughout, while we're talking, please, if there's a question that comes up, you can do two things. You can click the chat button, which is on the right side of the bottom of the screen, kind of center right. And you could chat in your question, and I'll be able to read it and say your name and read it. Or if you click the button that says participants, manage participants, you could see a little button on the right-hand side and the bottom right-hand side that says raise hand. And you can also raise your hand, and at that point we can open your video and open your mic so that we can see each other. Some folks don't like to be seen, they'd rather chat, that's totally fine. But we'd also love to see your lovely faces as well. So those are the two options, clicking the chat feature and typing in your questions. I'm sort of going to be playing Oprah tonight, so I'll be reading those. And again, if we have folks who are raising their hand, we'll call upon that person to share their question. We'll also be recording this video and posting it on social media with Spanish subtitles for our monolingual Spanish-speaking neighbors. We'll also be live tweeting in both English and Spanish, so we ask folks if they want to follow #JGRwebinar and retweet that information. And we'll wrap up by 9 p.m., but we plan to post the video likely tomorrow to share for those who are unable to join. So with no further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce Alpana Choudhury. She's a Jackson Heights resident, a parent, a psychotherapist in New York City, and just an overall lovely person, and I'm so grateful for her. She's the founder and clinical director of Wove Therapy, a deeply inclusive practice that brings intersectionality and systems into the therapy space. She has a background in applied psychology research, having presented at the Association of Psychological Sciences and managed projects funded by the U.S. Department of Education, the National Institutes of Health, and the National Science Foundation. So Alpana, I'm so excited to have you here. And we're gonna do more of a Q&A conversation. So I'm really gonna kick it off with the big question that we're all thinking about. What is your sense of how people are emotionally affected by the coronavirus? And how would you describe what we're experiencing? So what's your sense overall, how it's impacted on mental health, and how would you describe the feelings and the symptoms there?
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you to all the friends and neighbors in Jackson Heights and the broader community for recognizing the importance of mental health right now in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. As you've just mentioned, not only does our general well-being depend on our mental state, but the research actually shows that managing stress plays a crucial role in our immunity against disease. So we can see that link there, how important it is to manage our stress levels and our anxiety and keeping our nervous system deactivated as much as possible, and how that's going to have an impact on how the outcomes of this pandemic. So your question about how are people faring, what are they feeling? I think many of us are experiencing intense fear, worry, and stress in response to this crisis. We are activated. So depending on your personality, your life experience, or life circumstances, this could range anywhere from difficult yet, okay, I'm hanging in there, this is manageable, to completely intolerable, maybe even paralyzing. The most important message I want to convey this evening is that a lot of what we're feeling is a normal emotional response to a crisis. So this feels terrible, it's true. Human beings are not really built for trauma. We're not really supposed to be able to process large amounts of disturbing information rapidly, which is exactly what's been given to us. Accepting that this is hard is a really important first step. We need to make space and talk about our feelings. It's so necessary to manage our stress levels and to keep them from completely taking over our lives. So why exactly is this affecting everyone? Many of us don't really struggle with serious mental illness, or maybe if we have anxiety and mood symptoms, they're relatively in check under normal life circumstances. The coronavirus threat is a trigger, and it turns the volume up on some of our lower level anxieties. So for example, I have a daughter. She pushes my buttons on an average day because she's a toddler. So normally I'm able to see this as her charming way of testing boundaries and our relationship. But this week feels different. I can honestly say that when my kid asks me for the 5th time if she could have ice cream, I am way more likely to snap at her. And I feel guilty about this. But I want to say that this is quite normal, and this is what happens when we're activated. I would say in my practice, I'm seeing a few major themes in the ways that we're dealing with coronavirus. So I'm just going to outline them a little bit, and maybe you all will relate to this. Maybe you won't, but these are some of the bigger themes that I'm hearing, and it can help to provide words for them. So one of the big themes I'm seeing is isolation. So let's talk about social distancing. Right now, we're being told that social distancing is the #1 tool we have for preventing the spread of this disease. Right there, we have a paradox. Social distancing, while it may keep us safe in some ways, it actually puts you at risk for emotional harm. It can make you feel lonely. It can make you feel trapped. So in other words, the very thing that is keeping us physically safe may have the opposite effect on us mentally. So that's a really hard thing for us to make sense of, especially as quickly as we're being forced to do that. The second major theme that I'm seeing is grief and loss. And maybe that doesn't come to you naturally, but stick with me. This part of what we're experiencing is grief over the loss of things. So what we're losing is certainty, everyday freedoms, resources, even the difference between a weekday and a weekend. Furthermore, a lot of us are anticipating loss. So as this crisis unravels, we are going to miss out on things, birthday parties, date nights, religious gatherings. On a larger scale, people are really terrified of losing long-term financial security. Some of that has already started, but we're sort of anticipating this only getting worse. And then, most dreadful of all, we're anticipating the loss of health, well, for ourselves or for people we love. The third major thing that I'm seeing that I want to give you words for is just uncertainty. So the current projections that we have make it really impossible to predict how long this experience is going to last. It's hard to identify the threat. For non-scientific or medical folks like us, when you can't see the thing that you're afraid of, it can make you feel paranoid and even powerless. Okay, so we've established that you feel bad and that it makes sense to feel bad. We're alone. We're grieving. No one is coming to your birthday, and there's no end in sight. So what can we do? One of the first things that comes to mind is use good anxiety, good in quotes. So the funny thing about anxiety is that it's not always bad for us. Sometimes it motivates us to do the right thing. So for example, I personally have anxiety about getting cavities, so I brush my teeth regularly. Right now, you're very afraid of getting coronavirus. So ideally, that kind of anxiety can motivate you to wash your hands, go to bed on time, exercise, keep up with your personal hygiene, change into regular clothes. So some of these small actions can contribute to your sense of well-being. And you essentially want to let this good anxiety push you to take better care of yourself. So that. So the second thing is how to deal with the bad anxiety. So bad anxiety is probably what most of you think of when you think about worry and stress. And it can be overwhelming. You can be overcome with that bad anxiety. It can drive you into a frozen or obsessive state. You can have the same thoughts running in a loop in your head. It can give you heart palpitations. It can have your stomach in knots. It's not just uncomfortable, it's actually unproductive. And this is the way that it can be helpful to think about it. So whereas good anxiety pushes us to change our behavior to help ourselves, bad anxiety can leave us in a state of unproductivity. And so when this kind of anxiety happens and it's rushing our minds and our bodies, there are some simple things you can do. One of the easiest, most accessible category of things that people can do is called grounding techniques. Grounding techniques are little exercises you can do pretty much anytime or any place. No one even has to know. So the point of a grounding technique is to engage one of your five senses. And you're going to use the exercise to snap yourself out of an anxious state and return to the present moment. So you're not going in a loop, a circular loop. You're not going too far into the future. You're kind of bringing yourself back snapping yourself back to reality, what's going on in the here and now. So some simple examples. You can engage your sense of smell by lighting some incense or a scented candle. You can wake up your taste buds with a strong mint. You can check out that virtual dance party everyone's talking about and move your body. A second major way we deal with bad anxiety is what's called reframing. So we want to reframe difficult thoughts. We can't always change the situation. We don't always have control, but we can change our perspectives and our attitudes about things that are giving us trouble. So for example, let's say I'm feeling really bummed. I can't visit my mother right now, and I feel really bad about this. I could shift my attention towards, it's really an act of love to call my mother rather than visit her right now. So one is not necessarily more true or false than the other, but you can see that the focus is quite different. My third tip would be basically cut yourself some slack. We have to lean into the fact that this situation is not normal. And in situations like this, in crises, we are absolutely allowed to modify, even lower our standards for quality living, if it means preserving our mental and physical stamina. So it's actually really okay to pack on a few extra pounds or stick the kids on a screen for longer than usual. It may not be what we want out of life in general, but it can save you from a lot of self-inflicted pain. So we do not need to be judging ourselves right now. Life is hard enough. And the last tip that I wanted to talk about is, with all that's going on, there are still some very normal aspects of life, and we can focus on them to help ground us as well. So a lot of the coronavirus threat is scary and it's abstract, and yet in some strange way, life goes on. So even though there's a lot about this big picture that feels totally unreal, it's actually useful to focus on what does feel normal and sometimes even good in the present moment. So for example, you're allowed to be worried about contracting the virus. We all are. But you can also genuinely laugh at a funny bit in a show you're binge watching. Coronavirus does not and will not define us as human beings. So those are sort of some of my basic tips. There are so many more. I'd be curious to hear what other people do to manage their stress and anxiety. We're all kind of going through it, and normalizing this and validating stress at a time like this is incredibly important for individuals and for us collectively.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is so helpful. And I even, as you're sharing, I feel my own, like, oh yeah, I'm feeling that. And I think there's a theme too from the last webinar where we talked about basically homeschooling, or, being in an environment where your children are learning from home. And there's a lot of pressure on us as parents. And there's almost a theme throughout these webinars about like letting go of giving yourself some slack. Like it's going to be okay, right? If they don't, if they have more extra screen time, or they're not, reading books the whole time, that, we have to also recognize that this is a very tough moment for everybody, and be okay with that, right? It's the way that we're able to cope and make sure the environment is as healthy as possible. So I really appreciate that theme.
Yeah, I think what you're referencing, or part of what you're referencing, is that we all live in an ecosystem, whether it's our own little family unit, and that might be extra highlighted right now as we're essentially under quarantine. We live in a neighborhood ecosystem, a city ecosystem. There's so many levels that we have to keep in mind as we go through this. And when one aspect or more is being taxed, Everyone's talking about triage in the medical sense, but if we apply that to a mental health perspective, I think it becomes clear to most of you that there's something really unique about survival mode. And yeah, sometimes we do need to just sort of zone out, our kids need to zone out, or they need to throw a tantrum, get it out of their system. It's incredibly frustrating and confusing for all parties involved. But just sort of realizing that is, sometimes we need to lower our standards in one aspect in order to preserve another.
Exactly. And I'll remind the audience that as things are coming up, feel free to chat in your question or raise your hand. But I definitely have another question. Thinking about the moment, this real moment where we need to stay on top of the day-to-day information, we need to know the current events, the daily changes that are happening, the number of cases, the way to stay protected, right? So we need that in terms of taking care of ourselves, but what are ways that you can provide guidance and advice as to how do we both stay informed but absorb the news in ways that are healthy and don't add to that stress? I know personally, Twitter, you start going down that hole of negativity and it feels really deeply painful and traumatic. And, while it's critical to stay involved and you want to share resources, it does start weighing on your mental health. So how would you advise us to sort of accept that information without taking a toll on our mental health?
Yeah, that is a great question and applies to so many of us. There's this duty we have to keep up to date, to protect ourselves and to protect the greater system. And then also we have this duty to protect our psychological and mental systems, and the two can be in competition. So it's important to stay informed. But I noticed when you asked that question, and you were describing your experience of being on Twitter, for example, and your hand sort of immediately went to your chest, sort of gives me a clue that what you're doing well, and what most of us would benefit from doing is really noticing your emotional reactions. Just notice that you have them. Try to take stock immediately before and after you catch up on the latest headlines and opinion pieces. You're going to notice some patterns there, and you're going to want to assess what the emotional impact is on you and tailor it to your current skill set, your current toolbox. As we, as a country, basically reach a consensus on what are the daily protocols we should be following. I know there was a lot of confusion at the onset, and that's starting to become more and more clear every day. You may ask yourself, will following this news story actually change my behavior? If not, maybe I don't need to read it right before going to bed or hit refresh 20 times a day. If you suspect your phone habits have changed, I've caught myself in that situation. There are apps you can download to monitor your usage. You really want to just bring attention and awareness to your behaviors and your feelings, to recognize that link, and you will intuitively find a system that is less triggering, and a way to keep your nervous system less activated, which, again, just to reiterate a very important fact, is incredibly important for your immunity.
From Ritu, do you have any tips or techniques on how this can be discussed with children and how we can explain to them how their lives have changed drastically over the last few weeks? Yes, Ritu, that's a great question and something I've been thinking about as well. So, Alpana, do you have any suggestions on how to approach children about these major changes that have happened?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question, Ritu. I think a lot of people are wondering that. I mentioned I have a very young child, and we all have, all our children are different, not just chronological ages, but developmental ages and emotional ages. And that's something that's a very important factor to consider when you are sharing not just information, but connecting with your child emotionally about not just their idea of what's going on, but how to offer comfort and reassurance. So for the youngest sets, the just sort of barely verbal or very early verbal sets, like my own daughter, there's not a lot of concrete information that you would share other than acknowledging the changes, and really reassuring them that the things that they can count on at this time, they can truly count on you mostly being around. That can be really reassuring for the little ones. And there's not a whole lot more to explain, but you're just going to want to watch for cues and signs. Again, I mentioned tantruming, irritability, attention changes. These are all telltale signs that even the very youngest children are picking up on your energy. As children get older, you can kind of gauge their language skills and their ability to articulate what they feel in what you want to share with them. But one thing I'll say is, don't underestimate your children. Even nonverbal children, very, very young children, even pets, can pick up on shifts in energy. We're not trying to hide things from them. We're trying to validate and acknowledge their feelings while also simultaneously offering them reassurance about things we know to be true. So earlier when I was talking about sort of basic tips and advice on how to manage your stress, one of them was focusing on things that are normal about your life. So even though the world is falling apart, there is a lot about life that continues and moves on. And that's very reassuring to not just adults, but to children. And they really especially need to know this. They don't have the life experience necessarily and the emotional wisdom to reassure themselves. So that is our job as adults, parents, educators, and whatnot.
Thank you. We have another question from Cassandra. Can you talk about managing roles in a quarantine household? I feel like because I don't have paid work, I fall into some of the anti-feminist hole of supporting my spouse in his work and my kids in their virtual schooling. Although I never leave the house, I'm rushing from morning to night to cook, clean, and support schooling, and try to exercise, right? Take care of ourselves. It feels like when I have a toddler and when I want to put them to bed and stay up late watching TV and eating cookie dough, I just want some time to myself. Thank you for sharing that. How do we manage the kind of roles in the household when we're all stuck in a often small quarters together, being self-quarantined?
Yes. Oh, what a great question. And also thank you for that vulnerability and honesty and explaining what your struggles are. I think the truth is so many of us are struggling with that right now. I hear you on the gender roles. It's a huge part of the work I do. In fact, it's really important to me in my practice. And there's a lot of things we're fighting against. We're fighting against generational norms, cultural norms, the norms of your particular family. So while we can't change a lot about our culture as individuals, we can start to enact some of those changes in our own systems. Communication, I can't overemphasize that. rifts in relationships are not necessarily the problem. A lot of people think, oh, I get into fights a lot, or we're fighting a lot. Does this mean doom? Not really. So rifts and conflicts in relationships are very, very normal. They're quite expected. It's really how you approach the conflicts that can make or break a sense of resolution. I would really encourage you and anyone that's struggling with this to share your experience, speak from your point of view of what it's like. And if you do so without necessarily expecting a quick fix or expecting that anyone owes you anything, you might find that a certain level of vulnerability with your partner and in your household can really elicit a profound empathic response. You might be surprised how little people notice that you're struggling unless you actually articulate it or express it in some way. It's a really good idea to try doing so when you're a little cooler versus feeling really hot in your emotions. It's very easy to say things that damage relationships when you're feeling really hot and activated. But you do want to say these things eventually. And since we're all in such close quarters for the foreseeable future, I mean, think about how much harder it is to hide these feelings. And once you start to feel the resentment, that's really what we consider toxic in relationships and in communication. So the more you can ward off some of that resentment, right, by just asking someone to care about you. That's essentially what you're doing. Again, I think it takes practice on both sides, but over time, the goal is that you want to be mutually empathic to each other's situations.
Thank you so much. I think many of us can connect to that question. We have an anonymous question about alcohol, actually. When is it a good time to cut out alcohol? I've noticed liquor stores are still open, but my spouse and I are abstaining from alcohol during this time to stay clear and healthy. But is it a bad time to remove something from our lives like wine or beer? If we've used it as a crutch before, should we not block it out now? And it's been, at least 10 days since we stopped, and having less caffeine, replacing with decaf, seltzer, tea, as long as those resources allow. So I think that's a great question. I've actually talked to other folks who were challenging themselves with a dry March and this pandemic, kind of caught everyone off guard. So what does it mean this moment to give up something that may feel important to your normalcy?
Yeah, that is a great question, and one that I think a lot of people can relate to, whether it's alcohol or another substance or behavior. And alcohol and sort of that whole world of substances, it is a complicated one in that there can be an addictive component to that. So I'll speak to that maybe a little bit more just as not a disclaimer, but something that I do want to take really seriously. And I don't know if the person who's asking the question is using the word crutch as in to say an emotional crutch or a coping mechanism or behavior that without it, there's an underlying emotional need. But that is possible. So when someone is struggling with addiction, there's a lot of ways to address and treat it. But first of all, someone would actually have to want to explore and be insightful about what the role of alcohol is in their life. When people are sort of drinking more socially without a deeper underlying emotional need, usually taking it away or finding a compelling reason to abstain doesn't cause a lot of emotional distress. And right now, there's a lot of data to say that alcohol probably does affect our nervous systems and immune systems in some relatively negative ways. But, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't mean to say that, you absolutely need to abstain from alcohol and maintain optimal health all the time, because the flip side of that, of course, is our mental health and the balance, and kind of, you'll have to look to your own set of coping skills. Ask yourself, if I abstain, what's it been like these past 10 days of abstaining? Am I emotionally needy? Am I fraught? Am I spread thin? I wouldn't generally advise people to, nurse their addiction or substance abuse problems under normal circumstances. But it's really going to be an individual issue. And perhaps I should use that as an opportunity to say, there are times when, the sort of more common or easier tips that I'm talking about just don't cut it. And, fear, nervousness, relationship issues, things that are coming up right now, a lot of the feelings I'm saying are quite normal, but sometimes you're not able to cope. If you're having a passing doomsday thought now and then, that's kind of normal given the circumstances. But if you're having very intrusive thoughts or paralyzing thoughts that loop around for much of the day or night, that is a very good reason to seek out professional help. If substance abuse or substances, if you're at all concerned or inquisitive about the role even of alcohol in your life or something else, that's a safe place to process and explore those feelings. And, many therapists like myself are offering virtual sessions as a totally normal course of treatment right now. There's no shame in suffering or simply wanting an outlet to process your feelings. And there are just so many benefits of talking to someone who is unbiased. So your therapist will not judge you for your behavior, for your feelings, for what you perceive your inadequacies are. And I work with a lot of people with marginalized identities, including addictions. It takes a lot of courage to speak up, and it's hard work for them. But people who do therapy more frequently and for longer periods tend to function better on average anyway. Something like substance abuse or other habits that you've wondered about, those are excellent reasons to seek professional treatment.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to a video. Cesar, we're going to unmute you and turn on your camera if that's okay. So you can go ahead and ask your question. Cesar, you there?
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, yes. Okay.
Hey, Cesar.
There we go.
No, so, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
It's a little low. Could you get maybe closer to the mic?
How about now?
Oh, perfect.
Okay. So, I've been going online with my friends and using Zoom, like you're using now, FaceTime, and I just wanted to share that I've been connecting with friends at least for 2 hours a day in the evening, and we just talk and we share stories. So I connect with my veterinary friends from all over the United States. We talk about how the coronavirus is affecting everyone in different states. I connect with high school friends. I've been, connecting also with some clients. So I don't know, this is a new technology, and I know that the younger generations use it a lot, but I think it's very useful and it's probably here to stay. So I just wanted to share that. Zoom, WhatsApp, and FaceTime.
Yeah, and Cesar, it's so good to see you too. Thank you. Yeah, Alpa, how do you feel about this new world that in some ways it's given us, in some ways a gift, right? To find these moments to connect, and people are using technology for those who have access to it. and it's different. Like you said, you're seeing clients in different ways. Can you share a little bit about like what Cesar shared, that it's this, right? I sense, Cesar, there's like a positive element of actually
Oh,
reconnecting.
yeah. Oh, yeah. So at the office, I work in Jackson Heights. We are, we have to see pets, but we have to protect everyone, right? So the families, my staff, the pets. So what we do is we have the families call and leave their pet at the door. We take it in the clinic, and then we kind of pick a space, right? We go to Zoom. We go to, some people have an Android. So it's all those technical things. And then it's nice. We talk. Sometimes clients can't come to the clinic, so I said, well, I'll just talk to you at your home. And as long as I have a client-patient relationship, I just try to troubleshoot it with them. Sometimes you can. You have to come to the clinic. So it's just another tool. But people like it. I think it's cool, but it's new. It's not something that I anticipated, but I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alpa.
Thank you. So sorry, that's wonderful to hear. And really fascinating about how you've managed to use this technology, not just personally, but also professionally. And I've had a similar experience of this being totally unanticipated. And if any of you are like myself, I was a little resistant at first. I was experiencing that sense of loss and grief over what I wasn't getting in these virtual meetings, the things that I was losing without the face-to-face time. However, if you're able to adjust, and if you have access, which unfortunately not everyone does, but if you can figure those things out, what you are essential, I think what you're saying is you found some really useful, efficient ways to counteract that, the loss of the face-to-face interaction and some of that social isolation, and social distancing. It almost feels like a misnomer. Some of us are transitioning to the phrase physical isolation, because social isolation is not really a good thing. So social distancing from a mental health perspective is not a good thing. So what you're describing is finding creative bridges to connect people so that they're not feeling overly isolated. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question, I think similar to the question around alcohol. What's your advice around managing relationship with food in this moment?
Yeah.
I have like my own things to say, but I'll let you, I want to be mindful of time. We have about 13 more minutes, and I want to squeeze in a few more questions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So then quickly, food, yes, it's huge. And food, very quickly, I would say, is probably the most widely used and abused in this world, in that it's one of the cheapest things to access. And even though there is a ton of food scarcity in this world, in this country in particular, we have huge issues with it. Lots of systems that are impacting that. But I think what this person is referring to is when we have unhealthy relationships with food. Some of us have emotional relationships with food, and periods of stress are going to exacerbate that. It's really useful to be mindful of that. I had said also earlier, it's okay to pack out a few extra pounds during this time. Sometimes I'm grateful for food as a coping mechanism. If it's not causing immediate harm, you know what? In the short term, survival strategy, survival mode. If that extra dessert is gonna help soothe you in the moment, there's no judgment. Go for it. What would be tragic is if you felt really guilty about it afterwards, if it made you feel sadder, if it was going to be something you used to criticize yourself. And then you have to really be mindful of those emotional cycles. In an ideal world, you could separate your feelings from your eating, but this is not an ideal world or situation. So have a little patience with yourself.
Thank you. That was beautiful. From Pauline, can you talk about the stress of us, right, in Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, Woodside, Western Queens? We're like right in the eye of the storm. Elmhurst Hospital has the most cases. We're hearing from family all over the world asking if we're okay. And, it's almost like everyone's looking at us and in our communities. Can you talk about that stress and that sort of burden that we're carrying? And I even just listening to Governor Cuomo this morning, New York has the highest cases by far in the rest of the country. So, it's people are looking at New York, and then they're also looking at our communities right here for some of the highest cases. How do we manage that stress or sort of deal with that stress? Maybe like even that community stress.
Yes, there's, right, we've talked a lot about individual stress. That's a very valid feeling. There is a collective stress and trauma and sense. So at the same time, while you may go for your solitary exercise walk and glance over a person approaching you and wonder, oh, do they have it, and feeling paranoid, you may also have this sense or take on an attitude where you look at your neighbors and you say, wow, we're all in this together. And there can be something very healing and corrective about that experience. A lot of people are going to project feelings and notions and definitions onto us as people and as a culture. I know there's it's very easy to criticize in this moment under stress. What is everyone doing wrong? We hear this, what is wrong with people? I get it. People are really thin on patience and there's this urgency. But at the same rate, without judgment, I find that people's behavior almost always makes sense. Yeah. So if you remove the judgment, it's understandable. It's often understandable why anyone does anything. And we have to remember that and have patience with ourselves, with our neighbors, with the world. You may not be used to being in a spotlight or having, being the spokesperson or token of anything, let alone something so awful. But kind of, again, this is not a normal period of time. People are just looking for answers, and it's okay to not have them. And you can shift the subject. If you need to implement those boundaries in your relationships and conversations, do so, gently turn it back on them. How were they doing? Be curious about other people's experiences and maybe use it as a moment of connection.
Thank you. We have another question from Ezra. I found it really hard to face people. Oh, this is what you were saying. Walking in the middle of the street when me and my kids walk by, my dog walk by. I know some need to be more concerned about the 6 foot away rule than others in terms of being more immune challenged than others. But the pure fear of kids without masks seem palpable. How do I explain this to kids and stop feeling as if it's an affront to myself?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, the visual cues of things like masks and the sense of danger.
So maybe the judgment of like, oh, they're outside without masks, and there's, kind of, like you were saying, like even just walking down the street and feeling the immediate pass each other.
Right. You'll notice kind of there's layers to your feelings. There's these initial gut reactions, knee-jerk reactions. When you find yourself judging, it usually says something more about where you're at psychologically. And the fact is, we can't control other people's behavior. It's futile. It makes us feel crazy. It's exhausting. What we can do is turn to ourselves a little bit more in those examples, focus on what we can control. if it feels like someone is walking too close, cross the street. I mean, it sounds simple, saying it out loud like that, but it is that simple right now. And we can take comfort in what we know, some of the medical facts. If it feels too scary, if it's overwhelming, retreat a little bit, deactivate, de-stress, catch your breath before you go out again, or maybe do a little bit of mental preparation before you do go out. Have a plan of action. What would you do if you saw this situation or that situation, instead of letting your nervous system get so worked up to the point where you're paralyzed or you stop thinking, which is really painful. If you can prepare yourself for the combination of what you know and how the world is reacting, it's easier to work through and recover should something happen that alarms you.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we just about to wrap up, but I really want to end with the question is like, when is the good time to really go beyond and seek professional help? When do you know that some of these feelings, anxiety, when do you tell yourself, like, I actually need to pursue support, or finding a therapist, or finding resources that are professional?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm biased. I'm a mental health professional, and I work in a very holistic, person-centered way. So part of me wants to say everyone should go to therapy. It can't hurt. It's a really good practice in self-reflection and awareness. But the truth is, this is a very special time, and now may be an excellent time to try out therapy if you're curious, or you're just noticing that it affects the way you are functioning. If you can't pay attention, if you're so irritable that you're saying things, you're snapping at your family, you're saying things you regret, or being in close quarters with people that have poor boundaries, can be really hard to advocate for yourself. This is when seeking professional help really comes in handy, right? Talking to someone who's more objective, has some distance from the situation. It doesn't have a huge personal impact on them the way that you're thinking about the world, but they can really reflect back to you what they see, so you can hear it for yourself and start to recognize the ways in which you do and don't have control. Therapy, it can be long-term. It can also be short-term. It may be that right now you just need a little bit of help managing acute symptoms just to get through this period. And that's okay too. You could do it for a limited time and get a ton out of it, even if you don't have underlying mental illness.
Mm-hmm. And actually, there was two more questions that come in. Maybe we can get to it. One is actually specifically about accessing therapy. And I know doing health advocacy work, it's like somehow your mental health is separate from the rest of your body, and dealing with insurance companies. Like, I believe in universal healthcare and all the services and resources that serve all parts of your body, very holistic. However, that's not the reality of our system right now. So what are the best ways to find a therapist in our, via either insurance networks or other public forms of healthcare? I know Charlene McCrae, our first lady mayor, she has a wellness number, which I'll share. But what are the resources to maybe find a therapist that works for you, and find the resources to help cover those costs?
Sure. I mean, if you're fortunate enough to have insurance, you can actually find a provider through your actual insurance company. You can call them. There's a number of online databases where you have direct access to thousands and thousands of therapists. You can ask your friends for recommendations. It may not be a good idea to share the same therapist as a friend or family member, because you want that, distance and objectivity. But often their therapists will have recommendations. I'm available for referrals to troubleshoot some of those questions if anyone wants to reach out. If you're unlucky on the insurance front, as many people are, there's a number of clinics and training institutes throughout the city. One of the major perks of being in New York, very high quality services for sliding scales, affordable scales. At this point, a lot of regular private therapists are offering very reduced fees, even free therapy, pro bono work to help usher us through this special time.
Thank you so much. And do you have any, I have the New York City hotline to share, but is there any other resources maybe you want to share in this moment where people could turn to for some, place to get started?
Yeah, well, one quick thing, I realized just because we're in New York that there's a huge shortage on space, and that if you live with 7 other people, doing even what we're doing right now might not be possible if you don't have your own bedroom or your own quiet space. There are a couple other resources that involve texting. So that's a new form of therapy that's emerged in the past few years. It might not be something you could envision doing for a year or something long-term like that, but right now do what works for you. It might be a great relief and resource to you to have to be texting with a professional on the other line who's listening to you in a very different way than a friend or family member is listening.
Exactly. Thank you. And New York City has a resource hotline. It's what I understand is really not for ongoing care, but if you feel like you need to speak with someone in the moment, and I think up to 3 calls you can have with this resource. But it is something I do want to share. It's 1-888-NYC-WELL, 1-888-NYC-WELL. So with that, Alpana, thank you so much for your brilliance, your expertise, your compassion, your guidance and recommendations. It's all extremely helpful in this moment. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for doing this. I think it would help a lot of people.
Yes, thank you. And we are going to continue this series. We have a number of ideas lined up. Actually, Sunday, we're going to have quarantine kitchen because I know I'm struggling with figuring out what to cook. I'm not a very good cook. I very much support my local businesses and go to all the restaurants in my neighborhood because they're amazing. But right now, it's a tougher moment. A lot of them are actually closed, even when I try to get delivery. So we are going to have quarantine kitchen. It's going to be at 6 o'clock on Sunday, so please sign up. And also we have a poll, and we'll put it in the chat feature and make sure we post it on social media and our other resources. But we'd really like to get a sense of what are the future topics that you would like to hear, right? For either like a webinar style, a virtual town hall that's more engaging. So we'll put that in the chat feature or in like future communication out to you all. And on, social media sites and that kind of thing. But we really want to hear from you what's helpful and what kind of topics and areas we're thinking about the housing crisis and how to navigate, both rent and mortgage payments, homelessness, immigrants, ensuring our immigrant communities are safe, exercise, yoga, holistic eating practices. So we want to be creative with both like know your rights tips and tools with sort of lifestyle support and guidance. So yes, it's posted right there. If you could take a minute to fill that out, click on it, that'd be fantastic. And again, this video will be available. We'll post it shortly, probably tomorrow. And again, Alpana, thank you so much for being part of this series. And thank you everyone for joining. It's such a great group and there's such great questions. So thank you all and hope everyone has a wonderful night. Stay safe, wash your hands, keep your physical distance. I like that, physical distance from one another. But be well, everyone. Good night.
Yeah, bye.